to where the purple mountains reach away above the sea. If you want to find a haven, then you'll come along and sail along the lochs by Dorney, Killillan and Kintail. If you want to see the sunset or the mountains capped with snow, if you want to stalk the wild deer by Dorney you should go. You'll view the misty island and you'll hear the push to bail around the lochs by Dorney, Killillan and Kintail. So come along, come and follow me to where the purple mountains reach away above the sea. If you want to find a haven, then you'll come along and sail along the lochs by Dorney, Killillan and Kintail. Wild mountain thyme is growing where the bonny heather blooms. The shillings by the roadside sleep where old Scooter and looms. If you want the wealth the west can give, then you will take the trail along the lochs by Dorney, Killillan and Kintail. So come along, come and follow me to where the purple mountains reach away above the sea. If you want to find a haven, then you'll come along and sail along the lochs by Dorney, Killillan and Kintail. When my wanderings are over and I'm home at last to rest, see sunrise over Illandonnan shining in the west. The Alloch splendour looking down Loch Duig as you sail along the lochs by Dorney, Killillan and Kintail. So won't you come along, come and follow me to where the purple mountains reach away above the sea. If you want to find a haven, then you'll come along and sail along the lochs by Dorney, Killillan and Kintail.
As you leave Old Shiel School looking across the river, there's a flat there. Before the road came through, there was quite an area of arable there, and it was called the Pane. No idea what that was supposed to mean. I think it just meant it was a nice bare bit of ground, and the crofters used to raise the sheep and everything on it. Travelling further up, there's the loch, a wee Loch Shiel, and on the overside of the loch, if you look across or even travel on that side of the loch, a little quarry where a burn comes down. And in that spot is where the women, a wee back sort of before the turn of the century, probably late 1800s, where they used to milk the cattle. The cows were summered up on the flats further up the glen, and there was a wall there that kept them back all day. But in the evening the girls went up, brought the cows down, milked them, and then they were at go for the night, and they wandered about back down to what are called the Pane. And they sorted out the milk there because there was a place for washing the buckets, and they could do everything they wanted to do with the milk. So they just took what was necessary home with them. But 9 times out of 10 they would have a calf at home that had maybe come off one of the cows, and they would feed it with the milk they were carrying. The reason for putting the cattle up there was that the cattle would go up and they wouldn't stay up, so there was a wall came down the hill which they had been built there. And one of the little stories about the wall was there was a chap, one of the bows who came up with the sheep. He had a fancy for one of the McCrae girls that was milking the cows, and he was a shepherd. When he was finished hefting his sheep, he used to sit there waiting for her to come up in the evening so that he could talk to her. And while he was there was a big stone, and he was chiseling at it, going to write bow on it. But I remember the stone, and my uncle had told me the story, and he pointed it out to me. There was only B.O., he had never finished writing bow. So whether he had convinced her that they did actually run away together, the two of them. So there was a chance that they went off before he finished doing his name on the stone. That was the flat bit, as you can see, as you get up on the roadside, you're going up, and the only places of significance on the roadside are as you go up opposite the loch. There's a corner there, but it's always known to us as Kirkin of Hope. I think it means the rock where the boat was kept. You know, the boat sat there at the rocks in the corner when we went to school. The Loch Shiel is quite well known. The wee loch is quite well known because we get swans and a lot of ducks in it, or did then every year that we full of ducks, and it was a stop off for salmon and sea trout going through, and the fishing just above it was very, very good. Further up a little bit, there's a stone there, a cairn, in memory of a Donald Campbell, who was in the Great War, had got gassed, his brother John, was killed in the Battle of the Somme. I think John's name was mentioned on this stone, but something happened. But Donald came back. He ran that in at Clooney for a while, and then moved down to Glen Shiel. People now don't understand how the stone was put there, but at that time there was a little wooden chapel at Shiel. They were Catholics, and they built a little chapel down at Shiel, and his funeral service was there, and they walked him up the road to there, and then he was transported to Bewley. That's where they came from. The camels came from Bewley at the turn of the century. Further on, going up, you get to what's called the Coocan, on the Coocan corner, and most people know where that is today, and there's a very sharp bend there, always noted for cars trying to come round through fast. There's a wood on the right, the Coocan wood it was called, and there was nothing of great significance other than there was supposed to be a ghost dog in the Coocan, which was supposed to terrify everybody and keep them right. But Cudew, which is the Gaelic for the black dog, and it was supposed to be there terrorising people. Never saw it. One story has it that the fairies took a dislike to the dog and they encouraged it into where they were living. And when it came out, it was completely bald, so it wasn't a Cudew anymore. So I don't know whether that's right or not. I don't think it's right. Anyway, across the river, just from there, there's another very significant stone, and it's called Tlachavaskal, which is Gaelic for the christening stone. And round about it, there's a loop in the river, and it's just a flat area, and that's Lupavashkal. Now, I didn't hear this story until Uncle Johnny was probably in his 70s, and how to put in here that the old folks were terrible. They would never tell you anything bad about it. They were very, very tight with their stories. But as he got older, he came away. That was two things he told me about Bow and about this stone. And it seems that there was a diphtheria or something in the glen. And there was quite a population still in the glen at that. But the people that lived up at Clooney, there was about 6 or 7 houses there. And the children started to get ill, and they were very, very ill. And they decided they would have to bring them down the glen to get them christened. Now, the local people didn't want them coming in among their families. There was villages at Shiel and everything, and they didn't want them to come in there in case they would catch it. But by the time they got the thing organised, 2 or 3 of the children had died. But they brought them anyway to get the christening done, and that's why this christening stone was set up. And you can see that to this day. It's sitting there. It's even got like a wee font on the top of it. People propped it up. It's a conical stone about 4 foot high. And I've told most of my family, they know where it is, the boys and Glennis. Quite an interesting thing, and I think the story should be recorded. Anyway, a minister went up and met them there, and he christened the children. And what we don't know is that there's a little wall just out with the area, built round in a half circle, and it's possible that they buried the children who had died there. It's a possibility, and it's something that maybe people should put a notice up to stop anybody interfering with it. Back over to the roadside, the next kind of stop would be Strochety, which is we burn, pony burn or foal burn. There's no great significance to that other than above it there's a marker showing where Telfer came through with the road, a date mark on a big boulder there showing when they reached this point and what happened with different groups of infantry and stuff doing the road. And that's the road that went over to the barracks in Benelgan. And there's one there and there's one further on above the cutting at the Cooker, 2 stones. Somebody in Kyle, I think, has the second stone. The other one, the last time I went to look, I couldn't find it. But it definitely is there on the side of the burn, this boulder with numbers and figures on it and who was kind of. Somewhere among my photographs, there's a photo of the stone that went to Kyle. It's got dates and stuff on it. Further on the roadside, there's a little bit on the side of the road. You can see it, there's big boulders there. And that's where there was a souterrain. A souterrain was an underground sort of house. And that was wrecked when the new road came through. And nobody was telling them to avoid places, but they wrecked it. And it was, I believe, in reasonable condition. But somebody closed it up at one stage to stop the kids going into it. But then, when the roads came through, I think the bulldozers flattened it, but you can still see where it was, a pile of stones and big boulders that was there, big flat stones. Further on again, you come to Turleishi, and the huge sheep pens that were there, sheep fangs that were there when the height of the sheep coming into the Highlands. You just see the remains of the walls, the cornerstones and stuff are always left behind when they pull things down. But it must have been one of the main holding places that probably big enough to at least put 1,000 sheep or more into it, paddocks they had there. So that kind of covers it up as far as Turleishi. Turleishi I'll speak about in a minute. But across the river from there, there's Achiuran, which is on the Kintail side of the river. Achiuran, which is good croft land, good grazing land. And Achiuran itself has a history because it was added into the croft land to give some of the more arable land to the crofters at one stage. Above the Achiuran parks, on top of a knoll there, if you're up on the hill, you can see the foundations of what was a broch. There's a circle there on the ground. And the reason that was robbed, if you go down to the walls of what's closing off the parks, you can see the flatter stone, the good stone at the walls and that, but the rest of them are just cairn stone. But when you get along to there, there's lovely flat kind of stones that have been robbed out of the thing. And there's a lot of the stone on the walls itself would have been in shillings and stuff that were destroyed at the time. All that land that nowadays is actually grazed, or it's just let in deer forest. There's very little activity there. The Achnagart sheep come onto it, and there's that. Back across to Turleishi. Turleishi has the name that it was the first Macraes that came to Kintail, two brothers, and one went to Achnagart and the other one went to Turleishi. Turleishi itself, the meaning of Turleishi, I was told many years ago, was the lacy knoll. And I don't know why it was called a lacy knoll, but I lived in Turleishi, didn't like that, so they tried to give the impression that it was something else. But that was Turleishi, and it always was occupied, quite a nice, happy home. And there's traces there that somebody, way advance of time, had made a silage pit. One year they couldn't make hay, and they made a big hole up on the knoll in front of the lacy knoll, and they piled it full of grass. And they were saying that the cattle liked the stuff they took out, and that was the sort of start of silage, because they couldn't get the hay dry. But I'm not sure, maybe that's a lot of other things are romantic tales. Moving across back to the other side, there's lots of lovely names and lots of stories about from between Achnagart and Turleishi. There's the glass cairn, and where there was supposed to be a chap hiding there for years. And one of the points up on the hill, sort of a spine point up on the ridge, is called Speter Alsterian. And Alsterian claimed that he went up there every morning and he could see what everybody was doing, but he was still hiding in the cairn down below. I don't know if he survived, but somebody said he was going home all the time and getting his food. He had run away for some reason. He had committed some crime or other, whatever it was. Oh, the cairn. A flood had come down over and washed it, and I think somebody said to me it was 1760 or something. There was a huge flood, and Glen and Glen Shiel had both had huge landslides. And it's funny enough, and I think there's a bit of confusion, because the one in Glen the fields where it came down, is called Achagat, and the other one was on Achnagart. And they think that maybe there's a bit of confusion with people that were caught in the landslide. And there was a lot of the shillings destroyed. I mean, there's a row of them, and you can see the remains of maybe 10 or a dozen little houses that were there, but they were completely flattened. And one time when I was waiting for a sheep to lamb, I thought I'd dig into this ruin, and I was digging away and I came across a bit of tweed, and I thought, I think I've gone far enough. What's in below the tweed? I just sort of give up on the digging, but there was no history. A lot of the history of the whole of Glen Shiel was that the Free Church had got the records, or somebody got the records of Kintail or Glen Shiel, and somewhere down the line they disappeared, because I don't think they made good reading for the landlord or the church or people.
Someone didn't.
So I think they had disappeared down the line, so it was pretty sad. The other thing, there was a well just outside the Huron Park, and it was always used for drinking water. It was supposed to be exceptionally good water, but like a lot of other wells, just the water had gone underground somewhere, and it would have been cold and that, and everyone used it. further on still on the Achnagar side, there's all these names. Well, I didn't mention many of the names, but above Achuran, there's the Lech Kavui and Skuna Site and Screwran itself, and the meanings of these places can be found in any Gaelic book nowadays. Croch Kirpan and all there, and it's called the Croch Kirpan. And the reason for that was they were obviously making tea when they were making hay in Achuran. They were stopping there with a horse and cart, and it's such a change from today. They would spend the whole day going down there with a horse and cart and taking home a load of hay, and they would be stopping for tea halfway. I mean, it's 5 minutes or 2 minutes in a car or a lorry or something today. But the Croch Kirpan was always the people spoke about it. So the water from the well was good, the tea would have been good, so they were all stopping at the Croch Kirpan. There's lovely names like the Ivy Rock and just whatever people seen that place at that time. It's so different to today. If you went home and had a story to tell about something you saw, you had to say where it was. And I got told off as a youngster because I didn't know. That was the reason. You'd have to say it was at the Ivy Rock or it was at the Croch Kirpan. And you went home with this story, and you always made sure you could say where it was, because that's the first thing they would ask you. So it was the same. And then anyway, further on, next sort of stage is cart track, and most of the traffic would have been on that side, the Kintail side of the Glen at that time. People travelling up and down the Glen, and there's quite a good track, I mean, through there, all the way down to Achuran and to Shiel. And this track is still there today, but it's pretty horrible. You can hardly travel on it. To go back over to the other side after Thalaishi, there's this stream just below Thalaishi called Dortiheek, which you mentioned. And then there's the Plochgach, which is a borrow pit. And above there again, there's a huge history because there was a village there called Achnagar, and that's mentioned in Boswell and Johnston's Tours of the Highlands. And they stopped there at that village.
Really?
And there's still ruins of that village there today. You can still see the old shillings. There's 3 or 4 of them still viewable. And there's actually somebody coming at the end of November to do a film on that. They're coming to see Malcolm. But the shillings are there, and a lot of them again were wrecked when the new road came through. And one of the engineers on the road, he actually found a quern. And a quern is what was used for milling out meal. It was a big stone, and then the flat stone went on top, and there was a hole in it, and you could put a wooden peg and turn it, and the meal then fell down through the hole onto a sheet, and it was just ground oats. And he found a quern, and it's in Dorney, but there's 2 old querns, parts of querns, there's a whole 1.5 one at Achnagar, and they're there just to show what they were like. But it was quite a coincidence that 2 people, Johnny Ross and Jackie McRae, were in Achnagar talking about a quern. They were describing it, and Glennis, who was from New Zealand, and I've been back and forth there all my life, and she said, I saw one of them in the burn in Thalaishi. And we went down and looked, and sure enough, this quern was lying in the burn. So it would have been hidden, and when the English soldiers took over, they destroyed most of the querns, because then the people had to go to them to get their oatmeal. So it was another way of punishing the natives to fall in line. We're reaching Achnagar now, and a big history to Achnagar, because it was the first place that the McCraes came to, Achnagar and Thalaishi. When the McCraes came, they were sword servants to the Mackenzies, and they were given Achnagar and Thalaishi, 2 brothers, as a place to live or to farm. So they came there probably, I don't know, 1600s, 1700s or something like that. And there was McCraes there for generations. The Achnagar ones seem to have done better than the Thalaishi ones. They were still fighting and going off to battles, but there was one McCrae in Achnagar. He was called Macramorst, a big McCrae, and he was supposed to be very, very strong. And there's a stone up at the back of Achnagar called Clachacquaman, which he was supposed to have carried on his back, and the mason met him and said no, it was the wrong shape, so he just dropped it, and it's still there today. People know about Clachacquaman. It's registered as something there, quite close to where Clochaquaman is, there's a well, and it was Clennan's that were in Achnagarth before the McLeese took it over. And it's McLennan's well, and that's supposed to have sulphur, good for your health or something, to drink water from the well. And as a boy, I used to remember that old relatives used to appear, and they would send me up for a skillet of water to this well and bring it down, and I would be drinking of it. The only thing I could say about it was very cold because it was coming up from under the ground. Never got a kick from it. But Achnagarth itself was run by different generations of the McCraes, and it went through all the stages of the sheep farm and then a deer forest, and all the remains of the sheep farms are still there, the walls and all the stuff that was built. And the walls were built from the shielings that were knocked down from the people that lived there. There would be families, maybe up to 10 or 15, maybe more than that, families there at Achnagarth, and another village on the other side who shared the flat land down below, so there was quite a population. What they would have would be the bare necessities and cattle beasts to give them milk and butter and stuff, whatever they needed, and they would be shading the arable land and growing their own oats and whatever they needed. And all that would be the families then, they shared most of their stuff. And history of the other village can be got in Johnson and Bothwell's. When they came through there, they wrote a bit about the village and the people that were living there. So going back to our family, how we landed in Achnagarth was that my great-grandfather came there as a keeper because the sheep had gone off then and they were turning the place into a deer forest, and there wasn't many keepers about, but he had been down in the east coast for a while, and it was about Fort Augustus or somewhat where there was deer stalking, and he got the job at Achnagarth to become there as a stalker. He was a fair age when he came there.
On the 24th of May 1845, 90 people in 18 family groups were evicted by force from Glencalvy, and while the menfolk searched for an alternative place to live, the women and children were allowed to shelter in Croyt churchyard. Some scratched messages on the church windows, including Dolan's great-great-grandfather, who wrote, "John Ross, Shepherd, Parish of Ardguy." The women milked cows in a nearby field to provide milk for the infants, and borrowed a flask from the church to feed them. These infants included Dolan's great-grandmother Christina Ross, who was born in 1841. Later, the church was locked, and they were unable to return the flask, which was retained by John Ross's family and survived the decades in a wall cupboard that had been plastered over. In 2015, the flask was donated by Dolan to the museum in Inverness.
About 1902, my grandfather, who was out in the Boer War in Africa, had come home, and when they went to the Boer War, they were more or less promised that when they would come back that they would get a job. And of course very few jobs down in Lord Lovett's place, so any job they could get, and he came to Achnagarth as an assistant to Maclean, who was the old man who was there, Ushton Maclean, and he came there. And of course what happened quite a lot then, there was still one of the family at home. The youngest daughter was still there, and the son was still there, who was a bit of a layabout, I think, or something odd about the son, because he moved out when Tom arrived, and he was Tom Ross. And of course, a year or so later, or 2 years later, he married the daughter who was in the house, and the old folks lived there with him. The old Ooster Moore died about 1918, and his wife lived till 1928. So they had the old couple with them there for quite a long time. And my mother was brought up there. My uncle Johnny Ross, he was the one that took over the place when his father died. And there was Tommy and Maggie and Bella who all got married, and they moved away from Achnagarth. Achnagarth itself at that time was a holding. It had a service tenancy, and the person living at Achnagarth, they had the grazing rights for some sheep and a few cows as part of their wage, and it was always called a service tenancy. But when my uncle was retiring in about 1980, the National Trust, who were the landlords by this time, we agreed that we would get a full agricultural tenancy on it. and which was more suitable for me if I was going to get any assistance from the department. But we agreed to that, and that is how I went into Auchnagart, and that now was just about 40 years ago. Auchnagart has had lots of history about it. Just over the road there was a quarry. The Auchnagart quarry was famous for its stone that made most of the roads going through Glen Shiel and everywhere else. Quarry ran all the time, noisy, roaring quarry. And it's on records that McCrae that was born in Auchnagart, Macramore, turned out at the end he went into the ministry. Previous to that he was a very hard man, and he had been going to the sales and everything like that, a big powerful man. Well, that's self-descriptive, Macramore, Big McCrae. And there was highwaymen robbing the people who were going to the markets in Dingwall, and he was through one day and he met somebody he knew had been robbed the week before, and he said, well, we'll see how good they are at robbing people this week. So he made a big show of collecting money at the mart. He must have made some agreement with them, and he was flashing his money a bit there, and decided he would set off for home, and had his little horse and cart and was going along the road somewhere up near Garve, and these two men were out and they had a rope across the road and walloped him and knocked him unconscious. And the other fellow didn't know what had happened, and he came round the back of the cart and he thumped him, and the two of them were knocked unconscious. So he tied them together with a rope, back to back, rolled this rope that they had round them and knotted it, and they were lying on the ground like that, and he left them like that and went back to Dingwall and picked up two of the men that was there and brought them out with a cart, and they carted them back to Dingwall, and they were locked up. And they were saying that the men said when they got back that they had stopped a horse and gig, and the devil came out and hit them. But he then came home and he decided that he had some calling, and he went in for the ministry, and he went off to the college in Edinburgh and passed all his exams flying colours, and went into the ministry. He preached in Ardell or Glen Shiel for a wee while, but eventually went out to Lewis, and he was there for the rest of his life as a minister out in the Isle of Lewis. But he left a legacy of McCrae's. There's still McCrae's in Lewis, and even the McCrae's that were doctors locally were all off this Macramore. That was one of the many people. The other one was one of the other big McCrae's. Obviously, there was a gene in the family that developed big people. One of them was at the Battle of Sheriff Muir, and they were saying that the only way that the English soldiers would get at him, there was so many dead bodies round him that he couldn't, such a mother. In the burn there above Auchnagart, there's some aspen, which is not a common tree on the west coast, and they were planted there by my grandfather, who brought them from Kiltarlity. Now we'll move on up round the corner, on past the quarry, to Malligan, which is the next establishment, and long gone. It's been bulldozed flat, but there was a hole in there, and Johnny Malligan and his aunt and uncle were there when we were children. Grew up with him. Johnny Malligan turned out to be a great character and got many stories out of him. The waterfall above the house is where the water system is for Auchnagart, and it's lovely water. Road that travelled down, I mentioned it before, was Telford's Road, and it is across opposite them, and it goes up round the back of the knoll of the quarry. And someone said that there was a loch there, and I think that the loch had been formed because at Auchnagart itself there's a very deep cutting where the river comes through, and I think that cutting was probably man-made to let the water of the loch go away, because they would have wanted the flats where the loch was for arable. But it looks like that when you look at it. There's a knoll on both sides, and it's been split at the bottom. And it happened in quite a lot of places. They would break the stone, and the next flood would move the stones, and so eventually they got the water running away and emptied the loch. Today the road comes right through the middle of where that was, down past Malligan. Malligan was a stop house at one time, and that was because there's a quarry runs through there into Arnisdale and Corramalligan on both sides, and it's one of the very few, I don't know if any other, but somebody said there was another one somewhere, where a quarry that runs out and continues down into the other glen, and it has the same name. It's like Lagan. It's a long strip or a street or something like that, and that's why Malligan, it was just abbreviated into Malligan at some stage, but we're never sure of what the meaning of Malligan was. Just along from Malligan, there's a very good footpath, or a pony path, goes out onto the famous climb. up to the saddle, and the other one or two hills, Schooner Creek on the west side, that the climbers like to go on to. Quite a dangerous ridge, but sometimes that's what people want, and they like to go out climbing there, and it's very busy most of the year, people climbing onto the saddle. I didn't mention on the other side behind Achnagar, another famous ridge which I like to walk is where the Five Sisters are, and I may as well name them while I'm at it. There's the Sgurna Moroich, which is the one that runs to the sea, and it's a flat plain. Sgurna Sight, which is the fair one, or the yellowish Sgurna Sight. Screwrun itself, which is probably called Screwrun because of the wells that are on it. Sgurna Carnoch is just a well, it's cairns and rocks. And Sgurna Kishtatu, which is a very black hill with a bit on the front of it which is very dark and not very pretty. So there's the Five Sisters there, and there's lots of little stories about why they were called the Five Sisters and different things. They can actually be picked up, I think, on the internet, the stories of the Five Sisters. So we're moving on then up the road a bit, and the hill facing you as you go up the glen there is called the Coolan. Now, I'm not sure that wouldn't be its original name, I don't think, but the Skye people, when they were herding their cattle across, they took them up to the bottom of the hill there where there was a steep bit in front of them, and they were saying they herded them there for a few days until they would be able to get a rest, and then they would go over the pass into Glen Cuig. Pass is called Bialach Duilich, and when you're over the ridge there, you're down into Glen Cuig and then down in towards Invergarry direction. So they were kept the cattle there, and the flat there is called Rehulan, the flat at the Coolan. There's a well above the road and a burn runs down. It's called the Skyman's Well, and you can see where the walls were, where the cattle were held in and they were herded there. The hill on the left-hand side there is Lechanyes, and that's the first of the sisters, that joins on to Sgurnakish. From sea level to the top to 3,000 feet is one straight slope, quite a climb if you were going to go from the bottom. Next stop up would be Isnanaram, which there was a house at Isnanaram, and Isnanaram, of course, Aram is called for the army, and that's where the Battle of Glen Shiel was. Not much of a battle by all accounts. It was a skirmish, I think, more than a battle, but the National Trust have tried to make, I don't know what they were trying to prove by having visitor numbers or something, but have embellished it as a battle, and there was people killed there, but there's no account anywhere that we know of. There was a Dutchman, may possibly wounded or something like that, because the Highlanders had embarked themselves on both sides of the water on both hillocks, ready to do havoc when the redcoats would come through underneath them. But the redcoats had obviously come and assessed the place beforehand, and they set themselves up a bit back. And it was the first time that mortars had been used by the army. And they fired the mortars onto the hill where the Highlanders were, set the heather on fire. And that was the end of the battle. They had to scatter because the heather all went up in flames round about them. So they fled. They were backed up, and I think, not to go in too deep into the Battle of Glen Shiel, but the history is there for people who are reading a lot of accounts. But they fled out over the top of the hill, and the main Highlanders and that went home and disappeared, or I don't think there was any of them killed. The army just broke the thing up because they were supposed to be marching all the way to London. So that knocked that one on the head, and the army came in with ships and blew up Millandon Castle, and really the clan were put under a lot of pressure. Mackenzie still had it then, and got them to knuckle down again, so there was no more uprisings until Culloden, which was 40 years later. But sort of taught them a lesson there, that there was other weaponry that would knock them out, and they wouldn't be able to battle anymore with their claymores. The house at Isanaram was, again, it was just a shepherd's house or a keeper's house, whatever it was, and was knocked down when the new road and the new bridge came through. Above there's all the names on the flats. Lupin na Shannon, which is the soldiers' flat where the army were. Forestry Commission came in about 1920, and most of the left-hand side of the road from there up has been planted from that time on, and harvested and planted again. And they've opened up the bit where the soldiers were, and the breast walls and stuff can be seen there to this day, where they had entrenched themselves ready to do battle, but that didn't work very well. Above the road there's an interesting thing. I've been told that in the wood there's a little quarry place where they were quarrying live, which would be very handy, but I think it just ran out. They weren't using it anymore. Further up the road you come to Lupignorn, and that again was just a keeper's house. And Lupignorn means the barley meadow, or the barley field. So obviously it was a good place for growing barley, which would be good for making barley brie, which is whiskey or alcohol of some description. But it was always noted for that it was a place, and Eddie McRae was telling me there was a still just down, there's land there down from Lupignorn, and it's called Moraine, and it's where the glacier went through and left a whole lot of knolls just not far from each other. And then among that somewhere somebody had a still, so they were obviously using the barley to a good purpose. It was there, and in fact I explored round the knolls, and I think I found the spot. There was a wee burn running down, and there was a wall built there, and I think that's probably where they were hiding. They always had it in a place that they had a good view of the road in every direction, so that they could cover up and disappear if the exciseman or anything was around, which was a crazy thing. I mean, for all the amount of alcohol they were producing, why there was excisemen out looking for them and chasing them. But it's a way of keeping them under, I suppose. They were thinking if they got drink that they would go wild. But anyway, from Lupignorn up towards Clooney, there's the usual places out to the left there on the Lupignorn hill. There's the Alton Fjarn, and the sheep fanks and everything are there to be seen today. I mean, they're quite obviously there today. And a shed there was a smearing house where they used to rub butter and tar onto the sheep to keep the maggots off them. That in itself was a terrible job, because you would probably only do about 10 sheep a day, because you had to split the wool and rub in this tar with your fingers, mixed with butter, and it was archangel tar it was called. And after a few days of that, your fingers would just be raw, because it was just so hard on the hands. But they had to do it. It had to be done, because the maggot flies were so thick at that time, it was killing half the stock if you didn't do it. So they brought them in there. They had stools that they sat on, and there's actually a stool at Achnagarth that I made a copy of the ones they were using. They sat on the stool. Somebody brought them a sheep, and they cooked the sheep on his back, tied his feet, I think, and then rubbed this stuff on you. The wool, that when it's growing on sheep, is kind of in little 3-inch or 2-inch sections, so you can split it. And in there, and the warmth of the body melted the tar through all the wool. And every one of them were done like that, individual sheep on a stool. Further on, there's the Alton Fjarn burn comes down there. It's one of the burns in the glen where you can find quite a lot of garnet. And people today go up there just to pick up little garnets, and they use it in jewellery and stuff. And it's quite nice to know that there's jewels in the glen. One man saw one on top of a rock many years ago, and it was huge. It was about nearly an inch square on top of a rock, and all the rock had melted away round about it over the years. And he thought, oh well, I'll have to get it. And he was carrying his rifle at the time, and he used the butt of his rifle to give it a dent to knock it out of the rock, and it flew off, and he never seen it again. Searched for weeks to see if he could find it, but never did. On further up, you get up to the Dirach, which is the highest point on the road, and there's not much history in between there and Lupignorn, other than the names of the burns. And out to the left, there's the Bealach Derek. But over to the right, which is still continuing, the Shiel estate right through there. And there's no livestock today on any of these hills, but they used to have about 4,000 sheep on that side at one time. On then down, and you're over the Dirach and heading down towards Clooney into call it Strathclooney. After the first bridge and burn, there's signs of habitation. There was a little house below the road, nothing much up to the left. There's a few stalls which were shelters for sheep out to the left, and away out into the corries, Bealach Derek and different corries, horse corrie, and the different corries there. Over to the right, the corries are very deep, and they're very good for deer stalking on the Clooney side. But you get down from the Alton Fjarn, and there's a loop there, one of the flats on the other side, and it's called Loop of Otti. I'm not sure, the Loop of the Botach, I suppose it is, and there's a story about that where the house is still there today, actually, and it's quite an interesting thing. I met a chap from Kintail the other day, and the house was actually burnt. It was done. I mean, it had a thatched roof at one time, but they did it up, and there was a film about something, and they were using it, and they were going to burn it, and the chap from Kintail, his father, or his uncle, had gone up and taken the door off the house or the barn, and he still got it on a shed in Kintail. Well, the story I heard about it was that the house went on fire, which is different to what was on the movie, but he had stored a lot of hay and stuff in this barn, and when he went to take the hay out, he couldn't open the door because the hay was all packed up at the back of the door, and he couldn't understand how the hay got there. So he went up and he made a hole in the thatch and dropped down, and he dropped into a heap of adders who had gone in there in the winter time, and there was adders everywhere, and they started stinging him, and he was shouting to his wife to set the place on fire, which she duly did, but he died in there. He was either burnt to death or the adders would have killed him anyway. So I'm not sure. It's just a story about it, I think. Round about Clooney, there were several houses there and a lot of families who were settled there as shepherds and keepers and all the rest of it. They had a side school there, and I have the records of the school and the population that was there at the time. It was interesting to see all the names of the shepherds and the keepers who lived in the top of the glen at that time. And it ties in with a story about Crickavashkell, where the christening stone was. Proves that there was that number of families and children up at the top end of the glen at that time. And they go back away into 1700 and something, I can't remember, but it was probably before that happened. But there was that number of people living there then. Clooney, there's Clooney Lodge on the overside. There was a Clooney Estate house. There was several other smaller houses. The Alfmore house and the big house. Clooney, they had another name at that time, Raybui, and that sort of covers the glen from top to bottom as it was when I was a youngster. But for the top half of the glen, it certainly doesn't have a history other than the battle, and it wasn't heavily populated, the top end of Glen Shiel. There was nothing there for them really until the Forestry Commission came in, and they gave quite a lot of work to people, and they built a workman's hut, and I think there was probably about 20 people employed there. An interesting thing about it, and there's a newspaper cutting in the house here about Forestry Commission, new industry, tree mining in Glen Shiel. And there's a group of men digging trees out of a big bog. And what had happened was some of the locals who had got jobs there decided that the best thing they could do with the trees was dig a big hole and bury them. Somebody spotted them and they had to go and dig them all up and take them out of the hole. And there was thousands and thousands of trees. The Forestry Commission man who was supposed to be in charge got sacked. There's actually a photograph in the 1920s when this happened it was in one of the papers, and I've got a copy of it here. But I like the caption, tree mining in Glen Shiel, new industry. Somebody taking the mick. But list of all the men, they were nearly all McCrae's relatives of the man who was in Lupinyorn at that time. He was Alec McCrae, but there was Murdo McCrae and Bachan McCrae, Eddie McCrae. They were all there in the picture, the whole lot of them, digging up the trees. I actually worked there at Lupinyorn for a while myself, planting trees in the 1960s. And it was all, they were still planting bits of it at that time. I missed out to tell earlier on about down at the battle site. My uncle Johnny Ross and Murdo McCrae, who was the man in charge at that time. Well, he was just the man that was employed by the forestry, and they were planting trees above Isanaram where the battle site was, and they were digging up, just clearing a drain in the wood, and they dug up a pouch with musket balls in it, and we have some of them at home at Achnagar today as well. Original musket balls. And when I was in Achnagar, I was crossing the river below Achnagar one time, and I came across, I thought it was birds' eggs, but again it was a pile of musket balls, so they would all have been connected with the battle. They would have had a second troop down there somewhere, or when they were in retreat they dropped the musket balls. They were too heavy to carry behind, but you would like to know what really happened in some of these cases, how he left. It would be quite a good thing to have. It was a leather bag with the musket balls in it.
Valuable, yeah.
It would be valuable to him anyway. Mm-hmm. But it was in such a state the stitching was going on now, and so they just took the balls out and put them in a jar. But we still have some of them, the original ones from the battle. So I think that'll cover everything, McLean. We're talking about the Clooney area, the Clooney School, about 1890 roughly, when my great-grandparents came to Glen Shiel. At that time, quite a large community at Clooney. They even had a little school which is situated next to the hotel, still there today. Little wooden building, and it's owned by some climbing club nowadays, but that was they call it the Clooney School. It was a side school, and they had a school there, but there was quite a number of children at Clooney. I know of records that show 8, 10, 12 children at least out of the families, and look at what they had, a family of MacDonnells And some of their people are still down in Glenmorrison. Not many left today, but there is a McDonnell there. There were latterly coal merchants, but there was 4 of a family there. Up at the lodge on that side, there was Robertson's. He must have been the keeper there at the time. And that was before the Studdarts went into Clooney. Studdarts went there about 1906 or 1908. I'm not sure about that time the Studdarts went, but it was a man Robertson that was there in 1890. And he had 2 of a family, I think. Rebui, which is where the hotel is today, where the Clooney Hotel, a place called Rebui, and it was McLennan's that were in there, and they had 4 of a family as well. So that made up a fair number. And the Clooney Inn was next to Cruachan, just round just on the head of the loch there. You can still see the ruins of Cruachan, but where the inn was, I think the inn was closer to where the hotel is today, somewhere there, the Clooney Inn, which was different to the hotel. And there was 2 lots of 2 children in each place there. So quite a community at Clooney. And it's just after that the 2 sides of the loch were separated, and the north side was part of the Kintail estate, part of it, and the rest went down into Corrymore and down to that end. Now, Cruachan was at the head of Corrymore, which is the glen that takes you back over into Glenaffric, and there was a Moffat family there. And the Moffat family later moved, some of them to Glenelg and Barrastill, and there's still, mother of theirs was McDermott, and the McDermotts are still in the area, some of the McDermotts. The Clooney Inn, it was McLean's, and I think there is still some of them in the area as well. So that sort of covered the Clooney population of that. But it's interesting to know that, well, the Pavotic is gone. The Clooney Lodge is still there, obviously. The hotel is there's still a Clooney Hotel. But Cruachan and what was the old Clooney Inn, they're both gone, and so is Corrymore. All these houses have gone since the hydro were in, and the valley, the bottom of the glen was flooded. So all these places were cleared. Not really very much more to say about that. The bridge over to the lodge was renewed and heightened to let traffic get over onto the Clooney Lodge side.